The NKVD, the Soviet secret police agency responsible for ice pick murders, poisonings, assassinations, high-level espionage infiltration, purges, as well as brutal oppression and execution of everyday civilians, are one of the most notorious government groups in history. The People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs acted as the Interior Ministry for Stalin's Soviet Union. Their job was initially that of a regular police force. They were also in charge of making sure the new regime's prison and gulags ran smoothly. Having overtaken the OGPU, the previous secret police organization, in 1934, the NKVD had formed, flourished, and taken over as the top law enforcement outfit in the Soviet Union in just 2 decades. The outfit was led by top Stalin lieutenants, such as Lavrenti Beria, who himself would later fall foul of the regime, leading to his death. The NKVD were the front and center during the Great Purge, as Stalin bid to solidify power over the party by simply murdering his closest rivals, responsible for some of the most harrowing acts of horror against their own people. The organization actively sought to silence perceived enemies of the state. Anyone suspected of plotting against Stalin or the government would be sent directly to gulag camps to serve a sentence of hard labor. Admittedly, you didn't even have to be found guilty of treason. Rather, just suspected of it. Some people would be arrested after anonymous tip-offs, and others would be subjected to torture, which was, horrifically, state-sanctioned. As one might imagine, years after the group were disbanded, hundreds of mass graves had been discovered. It is thought the outfit were given quotas from the very top, Stalin himself, as to which types of people were to be targeted. Men of cloth, nobles, and intellects were all at the top of his list, as well as their families. In a dark comparison to what was witnessed around the same time in Nazi Germany, gas vans were used in Moscow and other smaller cities to get rid of problem citizens. Of course, it wasn't just political opponents the regime was keen to get rid of, and Stalin utilized his attack dogs and their specific set of skills for the distressing act of ethnic cleansing. More than 100,000 Poles were executed and others forcibly resettled. In one particularly upsetting incident, American citizens living in the USSR who were aware of the NKVD's activities approached the assembly in the hope of being issued new US passports after their originals were kept for registration. They were denied and promptly shot by their tormentors. Stalin, a man of little faith, had no time for religious beliefs. Under his orders, the organization persecuted and pretty much stamped out institutions like the Russian Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, as well as Islam and Judaism. However, it wasn't just at home in Mother Russia where the Commissariat were doing damage. They were also active on the international scene. The Soviet Union government were well versed in the art of espionage. During the 1930s, Stalin instructed his agents to covertly set up shops in almost every Western nation under the stewardship of stalwart agents and trusted Stalin allies such as Ishik Akhimerov and Pavel Sudoplatov. These spy outposts flourished, recruiting natives in each country they operated in. These networks had 2 main goals: to gather intelligence on behalf of the Soviet Union and to deal with any perceived enemies operating in those territories by any means necessary. In one of the worst breaches of national security in the 20th century Britain, the NKVD were known to have recruited UK officials as agents in the 1940s and also penetrated the intelligence services MI5 and MI6. You have probably heard of the famous, or infamous, Leon Trotsky. Sound familiar? Well, Trotsky was one of the most high-profile victims of the NKVD, tracked down in his Mexico City hideaway and murdered with an ice pick. Other renowned names of the horrifying group were Georgian Prime Minister No Ramashvili, who had funded and orchestrated the August Uprising, and Georgian nationalist organizations. He was tracked down in Paris, where he was assassinated by Stalinist goons. Of course, there are many others who fell foul of the NKVD, most of whom would never see justice. Arguably the biggest event of the 1930s, which wasn't World War II, was the Spanish Civil War. And just like any good Bond villain-esque dictator, Stalin also had his fingers in that particular Iberian pie. The NKVD, acting on behalf of Spanish Republicans, provided military aid to help advance Soviet interests in the area. And just like in the Soviet Union, The agency were responsible for establishing numerous secret prisons around Madrid, which were used to murder those whose ideas did not align with the Soviet Union's, mainly Spanish Catholics and nationalists, as well as Trotskyists, whom they took particular pleasure in eradicating. As you might imagine, World War II was a busy period for Stalin's secret police agency, and during the early days of the war, before Hitler decided he needed Russia for living space, the Nazis and the NKVD actually cooperated with one another. German and Austrian communists are thought to have been deported from Russia at the hands of the organization and straight into the unwelcoming arms of the Gestapo. Any student of history will know that that particular alliance didn't last long after the invasion of Russia by the Nazis. Stalin's secret police took up a position at the rear, making sure to shoot anyone who might be harboring ambitions of retreat. During the conflict, the organization were mostly used for internal security, but occasionally they were ordered to the front as a desertion deterrent. The stories of Soviet officers shooting anyone who tried to flee the Red Army by this time were infamous. Although never an attacking force in the purest sense, the intelligence officers often went behind enemy lines under the directive of sabotaging anything they possibly could. Stalin's agents famously set fire to Nazi HQ in Kiev after that particular city fell and set about rooting out and shooting anyone who had collaborated with the Nazis. One of the more infamous actions carried out by Stalin's specialists during the war was the Katyn massacre, in which around 22,000 Polish political prisoners were executed. Somewhat surprisingly, the Russian State Duma acknowledged Stalin's responsibility in 2010, calling it a horrific tragedy. With the glory years coming to an end in the years following the war, the agency's days were slowly drawing to a close. The final nail in their coffin came with the death of their commander, Joseph Stalin, in 1953. With the Georgian's death and the ascent of Nikita Khrushchev, the group were abruptly halted in their tracks, and their infamous pages came to a close. With the new regime came a period of reflection, and many victims of the faction were acquitted of their crimes, and their rights were once again restored. However, many were slow to trust the new government and simply refused to apply for rehabilitation, as it was crudely named. Rather unsurprisingly, very few agents were ever brought to justice for their heinous crimes. But in the 1990s and 2000s, a small handful of ex-agents living in Baltic states were convicted of crimes against locals. One man lived through the NKVD's campaign of terror. Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn maybe put it best when he said, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Stalin's attack dogs, like their Gestapo counterparts during the war and countless other security organizations throughout history, serve as a stark reminder of the cavernous depths to which humanity can sink. Their atrocities and abuses of power just go to show how costly unchecked power actually can be. But in the end, their ruthless cruelty became even too much for the Soviet Union. Reflecting on this period of history, we should really ask if the world, or humanity as a whole, can ever stop these things from happening again, or if we are simply destined to repeat them. This has been Nasty History, and I will see you again next time.